hate that.
Yeah, and it was
so
just
much.
an absolute blast of, well,
Maybe I'll just do half. I'll do one in, one out.
one in, one out. I'm gonna keep my. That's pretty good.
In the liminal space.
Sing, clap, and welcome to the podcast, then, man.
Thanks for having me, Graham.
How's I mean, we've already been through how the day's going, but,
But
you know,
it's
we can recap.
yeah, no, I feel good. I feel
Yeah.
that this week has been good to me. I've had a handful of things that I'm grateful for. I'm working toward promoting and preparing for releasing a new album, so that's kind of been an inspiring kind of energy to be in, and it was always compulsively helpful for me to be working toward something like a project or whatever. I think that's a pretty human thing, that you need some form of purpose.
Definitely.
And that for me manifests in making all sorts of things and trying to see them to fruition. So we're in a good momentum right now, and that feels very enlivening and gratifying, which I like.
I mean, by the time this episode comes out, it'll be live.
Yeah,
right?
That's it.
So you'll already be reaping the benefits of everything you just mentioned working up to, right?
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So it's a full album?
So no, it's an EP. So it's 4 songs.
Right.
It's called Four Maras, under my moniker All One. It's produced by a producer team that I worked with before on a 2021 release I did called Emotionauts. They call their production group Conscious Robot.
Nice.
And this is kind of like a coda or a follow-up to that. That was like a pretty emotional, intense album. It ends on a pretty emotionally harrowing note, and a note of grieving in this final song on that album. And then this one kind of was born out of a similar collaboration, except I found this book after a breakup that someone sent to me. Send your friends books when they need. If they're in a spot, send them music, send them books. But this book by Pima Chodron called When Things Fall Apart.
Right.
And I was reading that, and it was very cathartic. And in there's this concept of these maras, which are part of these Buddhist tenets, of these ways that we kind of avoid presence, ways that we avoid direct and open and honest conversation with where we're at, with our pain or our sense of being. And I have pictures of it, but like I wrote in the margins, like 4-song EP concept, like just
I love that.
yeah. And that's just always, I tend to think of projects in these like compartmentalized terms. They're not all like concept albums, but so the last few years on and off digging away at this, and so we're finally putting these 4 songs out, and it feels really good. I feel really good about the music, and I think people will respond hopefully well to it. I think we're in a time that needs a little bit of healing, positive energy and reminders of like, hey, be in yourself more. And there's a couple things you might be doing to deny yourself, experiential growth. And I know that in working on this stuff and thinking about it, it was helpful for me. So you only hope that translates to people that encounter the art when you're done with it.
Yeah. I actually kind of find that kind of fascinating, in the like conceptual sense of creating art to make people feel better. Right.
Right.
A lot of my own artwork is deeply in the dark of everything. And I find that makes me feel better.
Yeah.
And I find that, that's, people relate to it to feel better, of like, oh yeah, no, this is worse. Like this could be way worse because I'm seeing such dark things. Or it gives them a brief shock reminder of, this is ridiculous. Why am I so pent up about this one thing? But I struggle to make anything which is actively positive and in a different vein.
Right.
And so when I meet people who can do it, who can kind of do the motivation and uplift, which is required for something on a tone which is deep but uplifting, I'm like, oh, I'm kind of jealous of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how much the catharsis, like the positivity, I think there's a general positive insistence about these things. Like even when I write sad songs, like it's because working on, this is going to be cliche, but kind of like what you just said, like working on the art helps you process it, right? Or helps you process whatever the art might be about, whether that's intention driven or it's just you making and that act being intrinsically valuable to your healing or whatever that is, and processing subconsciously. But for me, like if I'm going through something and I start writing a song, and because my music is so lyric heavy and it's so all about writing and whatnot, like it's very much a process of trying to journal things out and learn from what I'm experiencing and represent that in the best ways that I can, and you know, whether it's impressionistic to really accurately capture in the way that art does, like, or visual art, I should say, or in just an articulate way that I'm like, okay, this is the pithy, you know, couplet way that I can sum out this whole concept, you know, and if I piece enough of these things together, I can represent something that I feel, you know, took me through all of the angles of this experience, you know, the darkest part of it, but also how do I maybe get myself out of it? Because all of those things are happening in this confluence of what you're experiencing, which is why it's so difficult to begin with, right? It's just this maelstrom of experience that you have to parse out over time. And art is obviously one of those ways that we organize our experience and share.
So I kind of expected this to happen. That we start the podcast.
Yes.
And we would instantly dive into something incredibly deep, skipping over a very important point.
Okay.
Which I kind of figured, because I've obviously seen your work, seen you perform, know bits about you from the person who recommended you come on the show, which was Kevin.
Shout out, Kevin.
And I already reached out to you prior, but Kavi was there. He was recommending you. But we skipped the basics, which is who are you? For anyone listening.
So now that's the deep question.
That's really the question. That's the question which no one wants asking.
Skipped. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So my name is Bruce Pandolfo. I'm from Long Island. I've been a writer and an artist my whole life. I make hip hop and, you know, rap adjacent music under the moniker All One. I write poetry. For the last 4 years, I've been doing a poetry on the spot commission project called Write Through Me, where I use a typewriter and kind of generate bespoke poetry for passerby. I have a folk band called Almost Elijah, and I'm a fledgling journalist. And the through line of all of that can be summed up in, I like to remix the alphabet, and I'm an oversharer. And so, yeah, I've been
beautiful.
Yeah, and that's me, you know. And it's been a long, maybe almost 15 years now of performing in various ways at, you know, open mics and touring independently and releasing music. I've always, like, recording and releasing stuff has been a really important, constant sort of drive for me since maybe 2009. And, you know, so that's a huge part of it. And there is like a pretty deep catalog of a lot of varied stuff out there. But yeah, that's kind of sums it up. Creative oversharer, alphabet DJ.
Alphabet DJ is a good one.
Yeah.
I like that. The reference of, you know, it sounds from kind of all the things and interests that you have that it almost, I feel like for a lot of writers, it's very much story, right? They've looked for a way which is to form a story, and the easiest way they could find was to write, and they kind of explore that through. Whereas for you, it seems more like the puzzle solving aspect kicked in to begin with, and then that led you to other items along the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that seems right. It's funny because long before I think of myself as having started pursuing the idea of making music and poetry and stuff pretty late. But looking back now, you know, you think like, oh, my life was so long when I'm 16, you know, but that's actually decently young to be pursuing anything. But even, you know, back in like elementary school, I can remember, you know, remixing Blink-182 lyrics with my friends to make them laugh, and wandering around in middle school and improvising songs in front of the class. And this was, you know, my dad is a musician. and not in any extremely creative way. He's made his own original music over the years, but he just loves to play guitar and sing.
For sure.
He played in bands and whatnot. When I was growing up, we'd get to see him sing and whatnot. But I guess all that to say, like, there's a generative. I don't know. There's something generative in me that is an engine of making. I have that compulsion. I can't escape it, and I just keep doing it. It's part of the machinery of the animal that I am. Is that I just, like most artists, I just view the world in potentials and emulsify them into things and share them as best I can.
That's interesting. So a friend of mine, Lauren, they're a painter, rather. Sorry. Who we coined the phrase between us, it's compulsively creative. Right? There is something within us which requires us to step forward and just make something, even if no one ever sees it. We would still be making something.
Yeah.
And I often wonder when I meet new creatives is, at what point did you realize that was going to be that important to you along the line? Because I recall having a meeting with my art teacher when I was 15 or so, and she recognized it. She looked at me and was like, this is something you're gonna have to keep doing. Right? This is something, because if you don't, it'll be bad. So I'm wondering where that sits for you.
It's funny because I don't know that I necessarily have. I have a couple of things in the mind, like in my personal narrative that that we tell ourselves about our origin story, right? I think one of those things is what's funny. So I think there is a creative thing in my family. In my paternal grandmother, she was always making things. That's actually what that song, that grieving song that I was talking about, Constant Reminders, it's called, is about her life and her death and her dementia and our processing that and the ways in which we experienced it. But she was always making things, and that side of the family, even as construction workers or were makers, they were people that worked with their hands. She was always making. When I was growing up, she'd make me Christmas garlands, and every year she would add a couple more handmade links to this long chain that she made for me, and that was a yearly gift. She knitted, she drew, there was so much of that. And she'd make us, even when she was kind of much older and not able to be as, I think, crafty or handy, she would still feel compelled to make us holiday shirts, just take t-shirts and draw on them, and what is this person who's in their 70s or like trying to connect with the kid, what is he like now, what's a Sonic the Hedgehog? All right, I'll try to draw one, I'll make you an Elmo cake or whatever it is, but always making. And I think there's that words and creative, there's definitely an ADHD thing going on that I've always been like I said, running around with my friends making things, being a general sort of ham and loving attention and loving. I think there's not so much of the silliness of me and the absurdity of me in a lot of my music, but the playfulness kind of comes more through the language, the work of the language. But I think there's just a general love of my ability to get a rise out of people, get a joy out of a moment and whatnot. And I think once 10th grade hit, I took a literature or whatever, poetry, English class that had poetry section in it. That for some reason resonated with me. I started trying to take the poetry part seriously. And I really delved into it. And around that time I discovered some underground hip hop stuff that was really resonating with me as well. All the punk shit I was listening to before that was very lyric driven. And I just started, emulating and making and, writing at least a poem or a song or something a day. And so I don't know. I don't know that I could point to any one thing. It just typical of me. It just feels like this big collage of things that I could point to that are like, yep, there's another example of me being a strange critter that makes things.
I mean, I completely appreciate that. I think there is a level, especially as creators, when you look back and you think everything's innocuous to begin with.
Right.
Of your life experience, you're like, yeah, this happened. You know, this happened when the thing, and then someone says something, and you're like, oh, yeah, that was a clear indicator of what was kind of along the road, or like what I might be
Yeah,
interested
you see
in.
where things start to germinate,
Yeah.
right? And the influence that external forces kind of have on you, and
Definitely, yeah.
how that mixes with whatever inherent traits you might have had, right?
For sure. It's interesting as well. You mentioned the kind of the idea of silliness and kind of fun, which I think is true for a lot of adult artists, or you may agree or disagree. Is I think it's often a lot more vulnerable for us to be silly, to be nonsense, to just embrace that like fun capacity.
Right.
Because when we create something, especially when we get to this age, we sit and think about it like, well, no, it has to mean something. It has to be some level of deep. Like it can be funny,
Right.
but it still has to be deep. Rather than looking at it as like, well, no, we could actually be ridiculous with no intention at all.
Yeah.
But doing that makes us feel very scared.
Yes.
Like stepping out.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Well, I think there's certainly, I think as artists, most of us tend to have, and that's probably the culture that we exist in, as capitalist kind of culture that is more about, being industrious and productive and generating wealth or money, at least not wealth necessarily. They wouldn't like that.
no. We can't have too much wealth.
Yeah, no. But I think, there's so much shame
Yeah.
about being an artist. There's so much fear of pretension about being, taking your passion seriously, right?
Yeah.
There's so much imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So there's an added layer to that imposter syndrome, I think. If you're an adult and now not only are you making art, which is like, why would you do that? Are you making enough money on it? Who's even looking? What's the point? Don't you have like bills to pay? And then on top of that, the art you're going to make is going to contain elements of whimsy and childishness. And I think it's probably, I made some distinction in a line once between childlike and childish.
Right.
Right. And I think like the truth is that there is no one. You can be deep and you can be silly at the same time. All of it is life. Alan Moore, the writer and comic legend, has this thing where he says, life doesn't have a genre.
Yeah.
So when I work on a piece, I'm not trying to function in a particular genre, because the same moment there's something horrible happening in that same week of your life, something hilarious can happen, or something beautiful and romantic can happen, or there's an element of mystery to your life, and yet at the same time it's gravely depressing. And so if we're really to imitate life, like I think having or at least try to capture life sincerely, which is I think some of the best art does well.
Yeah.
You have to allow for all of the elements to come in, right? And being self-serious is probably the ironically, I think, the best way to not be taken seriously, right? It's like worrying about if you're cool makes you immediately ineligible.
The moment you try to overindulge in
Right.
intellectualism,
Right,
everyone just sees it as, actually, no.
Yeah.
There's nothing real here.
Yeah, you're trying so hard.
It's inked feathers and all that kind of thing.
And on that now, like, I'm working on a project I hope to put out in March, which I might be putting my foot in my mouth, but my birthday's in March.
Doing yourself in advance, I like that.
I'm giving myself a deadline.
Okay.
I don't want to fall. If
I'll
I'm going to
clip
fall on
this
my
bit
face,
specifically, and
Yeah.
I'll make this the
like,
post.
yeah, question mark, where's that album? But I'm working on like a little mixtape, and a lot of my intention with it is to. I have been having a lot of fun with it, and being very loose and being very silly, and not going back 5 times to hone it and be overly aware of what I think is good or how, what that even means, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, the whimsy is very important. We need it.
We definitely
need
need
more
whimsy.
whimsy, especially as the world burns.
Oh, of course. Yeah. We've got to embrace just, doing things. I've recently been I've been trying to teach myself how to learn bass, but not trying to approach it in a way which isn't particularly helpful for learning bass, which
What do you mean?
does not make a lot of sense. So, I mean, classically, you learn an instrument, you pick up the instrument, and you find some music, and you try to play that music, right?
Fair.
You know, you do all that kind of thing. Whereas in my brain, I was like, well, I kind of want to. I feel like if I try to learn existing songs, I'll get stuck in trying to imitate what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than that, I decided to approach it as, well, the bass is the same as any paintbrush. I just want to make some noises. And if the noises sound good to me, I keep those noises.
Mm-hmm.
Which, when I boil it down, has like a really pretentious undertone of like, no, art's arts, right? We should make by feeling, and we should do that. And obviously there's a limitation at some point. I will have to read some music.
Yes.
But it's again, it's that engaging with that play.
Yes.
Right. And that's what I've been trying to do as well. It's just engage with that play and not think about it from a point of view of this is something I'm putting out. I'm just seeing what noises I can make.
Yeah.
And I'm really diving into that.
That's right. I think that's great, especially for getting yourself off the ground with something.
Yeah.
You know, a really useful thing I heard some years ago, it might have been the podcaster Tim Ferriss, you know, famously a life hack type of thinker.
Yeah.
But he had this quip that had to do with if you want to start something new, probably the best way to do it is to first imagine it the easiest way. Engage in that. And the point of that is to establish a routine. Because once your routine settles in, you can always add more. So if you're thinking about starting, you know, a film project or playing bass, you know, what's the easiest way? You know, I start playing around. I'm not sitting down, you know, intensely getting lessons, joining a band or whatever, and then you add more as you go. But that initial thing is all about that consistency, you know. So that's really helpful. And I love that you said, you know, like, I think it's true that the bass, you know, it's like any paintbrush, right? Like in a way, it's like any other instrument of creating that, like, I just have to learn to enjoy it first and know how to get what I can get out of it.
Yeah.
You can always go back and learn certain things or unlearn certain things. But I think finding it in what's in you to enjoy playing the bass, that's going to be, I think, one of the more important parts of your relationship with something, like a piece of art or a medium that you work in, that's going to endure over time. You know, because you're not going to fall necessarily, you may, but you're least likely, I think, to fall in love with the minutia of the technicality of something from the get-go. You know, here's this giant stack of tiny print to tell you about this thing from the most technically accurate perspective. Like, no, you just play around first and see where that takes you.
Well, yeah, and I think as well when it comes to anything where you're embracing like an art creativity thing, I think that's what puts people off. Like you say, they look at already successful people.
Yeah.
They try to imitate that. They join forums to get tips, and everyone in that forum has a tip of you need to do this, and this, and they skip that whole moment of, well, why did I want to do this in the first place? What was I trying to make in my own brain or engage with that wanted, like, I needed to pick it up in the first place, and then get bogged down in the details. Or they risk, you know, I mean, the way of approaching it the way I am is I learned to play bass, teach myself to play bass, get on stage to do bass, and then someone saying, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Like, yeah, I know. I'm doing it however I learned to do it.
Right.
I don't care about that.
Right. Well, that's the thing.
That's the fear, right?
Oh, yeah. And also, but that's the joy of making art. It's just allowing yourself the abandon and allowing yourself to, I don't know, disabuse yourself of the judgment, fear, and that anxiety.
Yeah.
It just doesn't matter, you know. I was just talking to someone who runs a great little cafe, a little coffee house out in on Long Island called Soul Brew, and the owner, she plays guitar, and they just brought back these open mics, and she was saying, oh, you know, I'd like to get back out there and start playing more, and you know, it's just I got to get over my nerves, and you know, and I said, you know, when you think about it, there's a really funny little paradox where you don't think enough about yourself to believe you should go perform, but you also think so much about yourself that you think people really are going to care and really come down on you and give you this, you know, fire and brimstone amount of judgment. And really that's the spotlight effect, you know. You imagine that it's so much more important than it really is. And all you got to do is just play around. And the worst thing that happens is you learn something and you go back another time, you go back the next session or the next event or the next, practice. And I think that sense of abandon has been something that's really like carried me and helped me a lot. And sure, I'll get super anxious about things, but not, I think I've had a similar attitude that you have had, which is that like just kind of trusting my intuitions or allowing for them to guide me a little bit in terms of what I think is interesting or useful or particularly effective about a medium that I'm working in.
Yeah.
I know I'm not the best whatever singer, rapper, poet, this, that, and the other thing, but I know that I'm going to put the work in. I know that if I combine these certain things, you're not going to hear, you might pick up on my influences, but I don't necessarily think you can get what I do from other people necessarily. And I think that like aiming for also that, like locking into your unexampled singular voice or presence in a medium, it's probably the highest achievement you could have. If anyone else acknowledges it, that's another great thing, but that's something else, finding your voice, the common way of saying it. I feel like I'm there, and that is probably one of the things I feel proudest of or best about. And I think that comes from just acknowledging what you're into and being okay with that. Allowing yourself to, I think, writing more, writing these songs more like how there are certain passages of books that I love, and trying to inject that level of line by line prose into the rhythms of this, rap section or something. And, just trying to, and thinking like, well, that's interesting. Just try it, and not pushing back on it unless, I hit a wall and I think, actually, this is stupid, which happens.
Well,
but allow yourself play, allow yourself play. And if you don't, that's where you get stuck.
Yeah. There's an interesting line a friend of mine says. So usually when I introduce an idea to a friend, it's along the lines of, so I did something stupid, or I had a stupid idea, and that's like the instant self-declaration of like I am loading this,
right?
So even though it's a very supportive, very wants me to succeed, I load it with this, so I had a stupid idea, and they always reply with, well, generally your stupid ones are the good ones. They're the ones which resonate most with people.
Sure.
And I'm like, yeah, but this one seems stupid, like particularly stupid.
This is going to resonate with the really stupid people.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's my crowd. Maybe that's the people I want. They say find your audience. And
That's
I'm like,
right.
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm looking for.
Acknowledge who you are,
Exactly. So I wanna cut in of obviously you're the guest. So we do pick the topic based on the guest, because the guest picks the topic. Did you have a specific topic today?
So I think...
Which also makes it sound like therapy. So
the one I've...
What would you like to talk today about?
Well, so when you pitch that to me, which I think is really interesting as a format, I have continued to think about what I initially sent you, which was... We've kind of touched on a little bit already, but I really like this, and I'm curious what examples you have of this or how you think about it. But the idea of people in one medium being inspired by other mediums, and I don't necessarily mean content, right? Like an ekphrastic poem is like a poem about a piece of art, and it's inspired by the content of the art and is just transmuting it to language, right? Yeah. I mean more like the technique.
Okay.
So the finest, the example I thought of most was Hemingway studied the paintings of Cézanne, and he looked at his paintings and sketches, and he drew something from that, which was a way of trying to capture life, a way of trying to capture space and landscape and color, and a way of using his, like looking at his drawings and sketches even and saying like, I need to do my version of what he's doing.
Right, yeah.
Look at that. He's drawing the same thing over and over again. Do we really do that with writing, or do we write a piece top to bottom and then we move on to another thing? And so, he would do that as a practice.
Yeah.
And that, I think, really interests me. I have a couple of my own, I have a couple of other examples. I have one or two examples from my own experiences.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that rubs up against anything that you've experienced or played around with, or like if you've watched a movie or something, or you've, read something and been like, oh, this kind of, I know how this can inform what I'm playing around with right now in this other seemingly unrelated realm.
Definitely. I think there's a level of influence which we have no real control over, right? This is something which I constantly tell people about when they worry about imitating other people by accident, or they write something. A friend of mine recently wrote a script, sent me it. I read it, and I said, "You basically rewrote Underworld. You don't realize you did it, but you rewrote Underworld."
Right.
And he was like, "Oh, is that bad?" I was like, "No, because it's 2025, and Underworld was made 20 years ago, or whatever it was nowadays."
Right.
And we're having this whole conversation. When something I find a lot with my visual stuff is I look at everything around me and I think, what could I do visually to get the feeling that I get from the thing I'm looking at or the thing I'm listening to? And song lyrics usually have a huge impact. Not so much with the words which are said, but the sentiment. And there's a lot of that where I listen to a lyric and I'm like, wow, yeah, that's the idea. That's the concept I've grasped onto. It's not, I want to draw, whatever they've just said. It's more, I want to dive in and think about, well, what if I recreate that? What if I could recreate that feeling, but in a way which is more connected to myself?
Yeah.
And then I can express that out. And I think that's also true for a lot of artists, but maybe they just don't realize they're doing it. To do it with absolute purpose, like Hemingway, and to study something, I think is almost a privilege of time. Whereas we do it every single day, and I also think we're heavily influenced in ways like that by things which aren't considered art. Of everything that you see every day, like you get on the subway, you go do something, and you're watching other people and watching things around you, and your first idea isn't, I'm going to draw this person on the subway. Your first idea is more, oh, well, that person has this emotion. I want that emotion. I want to feel that, and I want to be able to replicate that without drawing them. And I don't know if it's conscious.
Yeah, well, you've observed a part of life, and then you feel suddenly, inspired to represent that or to capture that, right? Like you're trying to lasso the ephemeral in some way.
Yeah.
And I think, that's a huge thing for sure. Even like sometimes I'll watch, like I watched the film Magnolia, Paul Thomas Anderson, great movie. But there's an opening scene with this little sort of a convoluted story about like the power of coincidence and irony and all these things. And in the first, whatever it is, like 5 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking like, damn, I wish I wrote that. That's so cool. That's so interesting. Yeah. It's like this little micro Twilight Zone sort of thing. And I thought, well, I wonder if this was more like an exercise sort of thing. But I was like, can I translate that to a rap song?
Yeah.
Like, can I represent that whole narrative, front to back in that way? And what would that exercise be? So there's that aspect. But then there's something more like what you're saying, which is like sometimes I will watch something or, I'll be in a space and it'll occur to me, like you said, like maybe I'll be outside somewhere and there'll be a stillness.
Yeah.
And I'll just start taking notes about that phenomenon of being alive in the world, on the planet at this time. You know, sometimes it's not rooted in the popular, the culture of our popular world and whatnot, but like more of just the phenomenon of being a human creature. Like,
sure.
and like, oh yeah, well, and like you said, I think I constantly have to stop myself from thinking like, well, I know someone else did that already.
Yeah.
Okay, well then what do I have to bring to the table? Can I put a twist on it in a way that is unique to me, whether that's musically or content-wise, or do I have something new to say about it? Or like you said, I mean, did that thing happen 30 years ago? Well then fine. I think there's probably room for one more. You know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's always, I mean, it's always going to be you're always going to tell something from your perspective,
Yeah.
right? Unless you're word for word remaking
Right.
something,
Yes.
reshooting something, the intonation you put on whatever you're making is what makes it yours, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's, but I also, to kind of like to your point of, I think there is stuff within work which I see others creating, stuff in my own which I create, where you see something, a way of creating, and you wonder whether that works thematically in what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Like I recently made a video, which is just called "How to Draw Perspective." It was a kind of semi fine art, semi YouTube narrative,
Okay.
and my whole idea of it was just, can you put fine art on YouTube? Can you put experimental film on YouTube, but do it in a format which reflects YouTube and somehow make it more accessible,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And that was very much, I'd seen a whole bunch of like pop culture from like the early 70s and early 80s where they just kept injecting fine art ideas into publishing and into print. And I was thinking, well, I'm modern day, most of our print is just digital video.
Right.
So what's stopping us from doing that? And obviously what stops us from doing that is the grand algorithm of content creation,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
most people don't want to do it because it won't get viewed.
Right.
And
You're
it's
just
that,
throwing it out.
yeah. Whereas if you just accept that this is an experimentation of just an idea, you can kind of blend that in and create
Yeah.
something a little bit more interesting. Or
Yeah.
I think that maybe that's an interesting question though of, so I know why I create. I create to feel something for me. Very rare I create something to feel something for someone else.
Sure.
But I find creators have an idea of either they're making something to interrupt an audience, to get them on board or against an idea which they're having, or they're creating for embodying a feeling and expressing that feeling.
Right.
Do you find you fall into one camp or the other, or are you a blend of the two?
I like to think, I mean, I'm always making things. And I
Yeah.
think at this point, like I have just have it as part of a process that generally my plan is to make to share.
Right.
So acknowledging that, it kind of, I think, also the fact that I'm not on a tight schedule, you know, I'm not some big artist where people are hounding me, you know, for deadlines, and you know, I have the privilege to experiment, you know, like, or I have whatever it is, the abandon or the lack of business sense, or pride or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to do those experiments and upload them to YouTube and not
Yeah.
get any views and spend $1,000 on it, or whatever it is, and you know, but like I said, I think a lot of the time I'm mostly trying to capture something as well as I know how in a given amount of time that I'm working on it.
Right.
I think part of that process of capturing is like there's the representational aspect that is a private experience, and then there's the communication aspect, which is the second part of the ray, which goes out to people. And I think technique factors into both parts of that.
Right.
And you know, there are some techniques that I realize, like, okay, well, if I wrap this a certain way,
Yeah.
it's a form. I think form follows function. You know about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like where the way that you execute something reflects like the actual content of the thing, so that it kind of coincides, and maybe even on a subconscious level, like it serves it. So if you're writing a fast-paced scene, you would write it with a certain rhythm that would convey that, or whatever. Or you'd cut the edit in the video, right? And I think like I try to think about that a lot more lately when I'm making, you know, songs that I'm not just being silly about. Like, it's like, okay, well, if I'm trying to be really emotional in this particular section, like just kind of speeding through very technically in this spot is not going to do that.
Right.
But if I'm conceptually, I'm talking about anxiety and panic and whatever, it would actually, I think, serve me to play around in that kind of way and do a kind of fast, panic, disjointed rhythm and use my voice in a way that conveys those ideas more. And that is, I think, a union of the two ideas, because I know that maybe the content, the words itself, is more about the capturing, and then the delivery system for how I convey those things, like that ends up being the communication to others part. Because like lyric writing for me often happens in a vacuum. And then I, for better or worse, then I, have it meet the music, and I, conform to the best of my ability or to my aesthetic sense, like to the music. So a lot of times it's just me trying to play around and figure out how to capture whatever internal feelings I'm having or external thing I've observed. And then it's like, okay, well, if someone's hearing this, what's the best way for them to hear it and get what I'm saying? Even if they don't get the words initially, like, are they going to get the vibe of it, and how do we balance that? And,
Interesting.
Yeah. So,
I'm wondering as well then, like, obviously we mentioning when we reference other creative products, for lack of a better term, creations, product makes it sound stupidly capitalist. When we're looking at the products, when we're watching films, seeing paintings, reading books, poetry, whatever we indulge in, I wonder if as artists we shy away from looking at the same idea but in processes we don't consider to be creative. So kind of industrial or managed items where I feel like we some ways, obviously we see the world as capitalist fodder and all the things which divide us and that kind of thing, but we ignore that and we go, well, no, that's evil, that's bad. So I could never create art with that and it have the same intent that I want it to have.
Right.
Whereas when it's a film or a book, we look at it and we go, yeah, of course.
Right.
Of course you would express yourself in this way and go through this process and create work in this managed format manner.
Right.
But then we look at everything and go, maybe not.
Right.
I wonder if we tried to make something that way, whether we'd still feel the way or whether the process itself would affect what we created and how we felt about it.
Yeah, I wonder if that just comes down to adapting to a format and having the uncomfortable experience of the compromises you'd have to make.
Yeah.
Right. You just going back to the idea of the good, like I think like I've had this realization recently that like we make what we make and we're happy with the end result because of whatever sensibilities that we've cultivated that are like, okay, that's what makes something good.
Right.
But like if you can reverse engineer or if you can kind of like peel away or wash away all of those suppositions that these conclusions you've come to, that are really, it's your aesthetic, right? But your aesthetic is, as much as it's a subconscious thing, it's also something that you insist on every time that you adhere to the rules that you've set up for what is good, right? So, but what is good is subjective. And can be peeled away and played with. And I think that if you feel stuck, that's another thing to consider, is that like, well, why do I think that I need to change this piece to do that technique again or to do that format again, right? It's like, it's because I think that's what's good.
Yeah.
But I just say that. Or because people, whatever my sensibilities are, I dig when other people do it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to be good too.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that. And I think like that comes back to the whimsy and the silliness, right, as well. I think that's like a really important part of the process as well. Is like you really do have to do this sort of weird navel gazy thing of but also not take yourself too seriously and pull it all apart and reassemble again. And that's where all that experiment and that play comes in, right?
I always find it funny of meeting so many people who see themselves as free expressionists of, I'm embracing the abstract of life. I'm going through all of these things and I'm creating, and that brings me joy. And yet secretly in their head they have so many rules about what they consider to be the right way to engage with creativity.
Right.
And it's fascinating and maddening at the same time.
Sure.
When you meet someone like that, because they they can't see it.
But yeah, they're
Yeah.
completely unironic about their inherent contradictions there.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously we all have them. I have things where I make
Yeah.
them, I draw them, and I'm like, I can't do this. This
Yeah,
isn't,
I
this
can't
isn't
let people
right.
see me do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you kind of, you play that kind of cat and mouse game with yourself, right? Of
Yeah.
everything you do, you second guess it, and everything you create, you're like, oh, well, maybe I need to twist this the other way.
Yeah.
And how many times do you twist it until it's basically back to the idea you originally started with?
Right.
Like,
Right.
how many times can you turn left? Right?
Yeah. You disappear up your own belly button, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's that. I think it's worth wondering again, like the imagined audience, you know, and what they expect and what they know. And is there someone that you're trying to, that you think of that you know what their opinions about something are, and you're trying to impress them in the imagined outcome that they would experience it and approve of it. And hey, if your number one top guy approved of it, you'd be fucking top of the world, right? So, but that may obstruct you from being more sincere or more pioneering in what you're doing. You know, it may pull you away from frontiers you could otherwise explore. And I think that is worth interrogating for sure in the process.
I'm curious, as someone who does perform for a crowd,
Yeah.
have you ever experienced the kind of phenomena of the audience pulling back from what you're doing
Sure.
because it's too much?
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
Plentifully. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, what I do and you know, and I don't mean this as a virtue, but what I do is often fixed in the idea of playing around with something challenging and subverting expectations and, you know, like, oh, I did this song structure already, or people expect this part to happen now.
Yeah.
And so what I want to do is flip the expectations on their head. And I just, because again, it's probably the ADHD brain, like, because I loathe more than anything the concept of being bored by something I'm making, and that's not why I make something. And if it feels formulaic, I get skeptical of it. I tend to do a lot of weird shit, and like, so, and also what I do is it's usually like these pretty dense pieces that I think would more benefit from lots of like at home listening or just traveling around with your headphones and hearing it over time. Whether or not I know for a fact it would at least reward those listens. Whether or not it's worth listening to, that's a totally separate question. But yeah, for sure. You know, sometimes it's just the wrong vibe. You know, sometimes this like hyper literate, dense hip hop poetry shit is not what the bar wants. You know? Often it's not. You know. And then you pull out some other tricks of the trade. You know, like Kevin and I will improvise and take stuff from the crowd and do the dance monkey thing of just like, hey, we can do this crazy party trick, like let's pull you in. But I think that's also a performance thing, right? So you do make, like, if you are going to perform, and this has often been a difficult thing, like ideally, yeah, it would be great if everything was an NPR Tiny Desk concert, everyone was there for the exact experience that whatever you, the artist, decided to curate, they were going to like experience it and be present for it and respect it. That would be awesome. But that's not what performing is. And that's not what being, especially an independent, like grassroots underground artist is ever going to be. You know, you're thrust into weird situations and you've got to figure it out. And so there's the balance that you have to find of, okay, it's a show. I'm entertaining. People are here in the moment, in the room. I planned it to go one way, as with all things in life. It's going to be derailed. It's going to go different ways. You know how many times I painstakingly, almost every show, every performance, I painstakingly curate a set list, and then I change it all the way up to the last minute, including when I'm on stage. I drop this, I do this song I didn't even rehearse and plan, and we just, you know, get our way through it. Because the vibe is there. You are part of a living, breathing organism of the moment and when you're performing. And I think like acknowledging that will only make you a better performer. And I don't, and I could certainly be much better. I'm not like a MC who, you know, who is going to go into every room and be like, I'm going to get the crowd crazy every time.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes that's just not where I'm at. I don't want that. That's not where I'm at personally.
Yeah.
And I'm not willing to do that. Sometimes I'm like, I'm going to try to bring you to where I'm at and what I've brought to you. And I have to do the scary thing of believing that what I'm bringing to you is sincere and worth your time if you're willing to give me it. But I think you earn that. So sometimes you do the really difficult, you do some difficult songs, and then you do like a fun one, and then you do like the really, bring it really low down, right? I love creating the arc of experience for a show, and like, then you get more credit with the audience. So like maybe you do the freestyle, like right in the meat of the set where like, I just brought you down. Okay, I'll reward you. Let's have a fun thing where you have this moment where you make a song with me or something, or it's been a lot of music. It's very dense. Let's bring it into like a spoken word interlude poem where there's no music. It's slow. It's chill. I come off the mic. I walk into the crowd. Like we have a connective human moment, and then we can get back to this other shit. And I think knowing about and honoring those dynamics and being humble enough as a performer and an artist to give over yourself to a room, like that's probably your best bet.
See, that's, to me, as a visual artist who, I think, I always find that fascinating, right? The work you're creating is so impacted by the way you have to put that work out into the world.
Yeah.
Right. I create visual art, so I intentionally put a barrier between me and everybody else by putting it somewhere and walking the hell away. Right.
Yeah.
The idea of changing that on the fly with the person there seems insane, but like you're saying, it's that kind of thing where the idea of doing that fascinates me.
Yeah.
As a method. Right?
Right.
Visual art, which can change on the whim of the audience and how the audience needs to react to it,
right,
is an insane concept.
Right.
But it's fascinating to think, oh, what if you could? Like, what could you slide that in?
Is there something participatory that you could do? Or, yeah, absolutely.
And again, I think that kind of like leads into the question you were asking. It was like, there is moments where there is a full blend of just watching someone else do something and being like, that's interesting as an approach.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, what's my version of that? Is there one? Could I make one? Right. I think that's really fascinating. So I was reading, on this new album, there's a song called Diva Putra. It essentially means like, basically like hedonism, like escaping your bad feelings by just chasing all the good feelings. Right?
Course, yeah.
That's like what that Mara is. But while I was working on this song, I was reading a lot of Cormac McCarthy, and there's a rhythm, and I was really curious about it. There's a rhythm of his writing, his prose, where he uses a lot of conjunctions and uses a lot of run-on sentences to create this sort of like loping feeling that it just kind of keeps going. So I was curious. I was reading about him. I looked it up, and it's this concept that's called polysyndetic writing, and but the feeling is, he walked into the room, and then he picked up the coffee, and he took a sip, and he walked over to the shelf, and he looked at the old picture of his family, and it reminded him of, and so you have this almost play by play where you're being walked through a scene by the continuation that ignores most rules of proper grammar and writing and what you're taught in school. And so like I looked at that and I said, how could that translate into, like, how can I translate that musically? So it would make for some interesting phrasing where you keep thinking that the end of the line would come, but like I keep it going and I ride the same rhyme scheme. So I have this section of the song where I say, and there was music in it where it kind of breaks into this halftime thing, and I wanted to like make this driving kind of punching sentence essentially, but keep it moving. And so it's this: if you gaze in the face of your pain, then you're changing its shape as you name it with grace, as you bravely say it's okay as I tame it. I'm training my brain to relay that it ain't gonna break me. And that is to me is 2 lines, but they elapse over the course of like 4 bars or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just keeps going where you think it would stop.
Yeah.
And then, so it's on an A rhyme pattern, the gaze in the face of the pain, then you change it, shape it, you name it with grace as you, and then I give it punctuation by changing the rhyme pattern bravely, and then go back to the A, and then end it on break me. And that's just kind of like one of my more recent like examples of looking at something in another form and being like, oh, is that something I wonder if I could do that.
Yeah.
Or like taking another one I've been playing around with is I love drumming. I can't really drum well, but the patterning and stuff makes sense to me with how I write music and rapping and all that stuff. Poetry and writing is all just like weird word math, or poetry and rapping for sure. But like paradiddles, like left, right, left, right, left, right, right. And so I was looking at that and I was like, oh, what if you patterned rhymes that way? So you have an A, B, A, B, A, B, B, and like people don't really do that. So it might be an interesting way to map it out. And so, it's just those little things of like just looking at something and like, how does that apply?
Yeah.
How could I play around with what I do and just make something different?
I love that.
But it's about being, like you said, it's always about play. It's about being open. It's about, I think like just being humbled by and allowing yourself to kind of be a functional antenna to what you receive as you wander around.
Yeah, I love that. I definitely think that's kind of a nice point to kind of bring it to is it's that leaving yourself open to be influenced and inspired by things which one you may see as completely disconnected from what you're doing,
right?
And two, just looking at everything which is around you and wondering, well, how does that get made, right? Like how does that get to the point which is what is the method for this? Because I enjoy this. What does that mean for my making?
Right.
And what does that mean for my creation when I step out and go, okay, let's try this now.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
I mean, stay curious and be aware of the potential in everything. I think, those are, I think, 2 tenets of being an artist or being creative at all that I think are things that will maintain you and serve you over time.
That's a wonderful note to round that out on. And it also leads us to my 2 final questions.
Okay.
If you would. One of them, so I feel like we just gave fantastic artistic advice. But I have a question each year, which I'm changing each year. I started last year with one question. This year is a completely different question.
Okay.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to art. What is some great advice?
About making art.
About anything.
So just some
Just
great
what
advice.
is some great advice?
Oh, wow.
Because I feel like it's not necessarily telling, but I feel like it's interesting that what someone would consider some just great advice.
I think everything comes down to being aware of what you're attentive to and what you place your attention on. That it's a very Buddhist tenet. It's a very, but it really does when you consider all of life and everything, like whether it's the relationships in your life or the things that you're doing, like where you put your attention is what you're going to take in. It's what you're going to put out. It's what you're processing. And if you're not aware of where you're putting your attention, then you're going to be co-opted by the moment or by external forces or internal forces, even if you're not aware enough of what's going on in you. You're just going to be completely, kidnapped by whatever's happening to you. So I think awareness of the moment, awareness, presence, and an awareness of your attention and how you spend it or where you aim that beam of of consciousness. I think that's probably the biggest lesson in the last several years of my life, that I think has made me really appreciate and be in concert with the experiences I'm having a lot more and the people that I'm spending time with a lot more. Is that very self-aware sort of use of attention and how we aim it and what we do with it.
Definitely. I think that's some great advice. I think that's a solid piece of information for the people out there.
I was like, what's the one that everything else boils down to?
Yes.
That feels like, to me, that's the main one.
Yeah.
That everything else you can get there by starting there.
Yeah.
Or you can solve a lot
everything
of
else
things.
falls into place. when you
Right,
have
yeah.
this
If you have
initial
that,
core
I
idea.
think a lot of your stuff, inwardly and outwardly, is going to start to come into focus, or fall out of focus, and you'll find you didn't need it.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. All right. Well, this brings me on to my final question. of the day,
okay.
which, depending if you watch the podcast or not, you may or may not know. No, it's not necessary to watch it to be on it.
Okay.
I will say, no purchase necessary. Terms and conditions apply. Obviously, I chat to anybody. So who should I speak to next?
Ooh, wow. Man, so many people
Yeah.
come to mind. That's hard. That's a really tough one.
Yeah.
I could give you a big list.
I'm always open to a big list.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, the first one of the first friends of mine that comes to mind is my buddy Mike Setti. He's a longtime collaborator of mine and a best friend, and he just finished up a project. It's an Oracle deck, but he's a visual artist. I think you'd like his work. He's a graphic designer, and he's been involved in a lot of my work over the last 15 years. And I think he has really interesting philosophical views on creating and on art. I think he's been experimenting for a long time, and he's a drummer. He's a writer, and I've lived with the guy for many years at one point, and we've had tons of great conversations like this just on the reg. So yeah, I could send you his contact info, but that's one of the people that comes to mind for sure.
That'd be lovely. I feel like that'd be, a good connection to make.
Yeah, yeah.
Talk to, I keep finding I'm waiting for someone to recommend someone they think I would hate, because everyone goes with, I think you'd really like to talk to this person, and no one's yet gone, you would hate talking to this person. You should definitely speak to this person. This is awful. But one day it will happen.
Well, anyone that I would think you'd hate to talk to, I probably wouldn't admit it in a recorded situation that I think they're a hateable conversationalist.
I mean, one way or another, it depends how we get here.
That's true. That's true.
But it's been lovely to speak to you, Bruce.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for
coming
having me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
On that note, we'll take the great advice and we'll roll on to the next one.
All right.
We'll talk to these guys later.
Okay. Take care.